It all begins with a fact so strange it feels like a mistake. In the autumn of 1943, with the war raging on all fronts, a massive convoy of Allied ships was heading through the North Atlantic. These were the supply ships, the lifeline to the Soviet Union, carrying everything from tanks to food. They were always in danger from German U-boats, but this convoy, known as PQ-17, faced no enemy attack. Instead, on a clear and cold morning, the entire fleet just stopped. The orders came from the highest level, a sudden command to disperse and scatter. Officially, the reason was a threat from a powerful German battleship group, a threat that turned out to be a false alarm. The result was chaos. The scattered ships were easy pickings for the actual U-boats and planes, and the convoy suffered devastating losses. The official story was a tragedy of bad intelligence, a footnote in the history of a massive war. But a few people, looking back decades later, started to feel that the official story didn't quite add up. It was too neat, too simple. The truth, they suspected, was buried much deeper. Our story really takes us to a quiet, dusty corner of London. This is where we meet Dr. Elena Vance. She's not a spy or a soldier. She's a historian, someone who spends her days in the company of the dead, specifically, their documents. Her office is stacked with books, and the air always smells like old paper and brewing tea. Elena loves the quiet, the slow methodical work of piecing together the past from what people left behind. She was working on a fairly routine project, a book about Allied logistics during the war. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly reading shipping manifests and weather reports from the 1940s. Most historians would find it dull, but Elena enjoyed it. She saw it as the skeleton of history, the bones that held everything else up. On one particular Tuesday, she was sifting through the personal effects of a man who had been a low-level shipping clerk during the war. There wasn't much of interest, mostly just notes about cargo tonnage and port schedules. But then she opened his personal diary. It wasn't a record of great events, just the small thoughts of a man living through a huge time. He wrote about the food rationing, his worrying for his brother in the army, the cold winters in London. Then she got to the entry from the day the convoy was scattered. His handwriting, usually neat and steady, became shaky, almost panicked. He wrote about the confusing orders that came in, the chaos on the docks. It was all standard stuff, something Elena had read 100 times before. But as she was about to turn the page, her eyes caught something in the margin. It wasn't part of his diary entry. It was a single word, written in a different colored ink, almost like an afterthought or a reminder to himself. The word was Kane's mark. Elena had been studying this period for years. She knew the names, the places, the key players. She had never, ever heard the word Kane's mark. It didn't sound like a code name the military would use. It sounded more like a place, or maybe a family name. She jotted it down in her notebook and went back to her work, but the word stayed with her, like a song she couldn't get out of her head. It felt important. For the next few weeks, she treated it like a side project, a small puzzle to solve in between her real research. She looked through official military records. Nothing. She searched diplomatic cables. Nothing. She went through the declassified files of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. Again, nothing. The word Kane's mark simply did not exist in the official record of the Second World War. It was a dead end, a ghost. Most historians would have left it there, dismissed it as a clerk's private, meaningless note. But Elena couldn't let it go. The breakthrough came by accident. She was researching financial records, trying to trace the funding for a specific construction project. Her search led her to the archives of a major bank in Switzerland, a country that had remained neutral during the war. She was looking at transaction logs from the 1940s, lines and lines of numbers and names. It was tedious, a straining work. Then a name on the screen made her sit up straight. It was a corporate name, Kane's Mark Holdings. It was listed as a shell corporation, a company that exists only on paper to handle financial transactions. The most startling part was the date of a major transfer, a huge sum of money from a German industrial concern through this shell corporation to an account in Argentina. The date of the transaction was the exact same day the convoy was ordered to scatter. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air in the archive. This was no coincidence. Someone, operating under the name Kane's Mark, was moving huge amounts of money right in the middle of the war, and the timing was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a footnote. This was a link. This was proof that something secret was happening behind the scenes. She started pulling on this single thread, and what she began to uncover was more incredible than she could have imagined. She found a university file for a brilliant physicist in Berlin who suddenly vanished from his post in 1942. In the Dean's notes from the week of his disappearance, there was a single reference, contact with Kane's Mark established. She found a memo from the American embassy in Lisbon about a Portuguese banker who suddenly became one of the wealthiest men in Europe, funding all sorts of charitable projects. The source of his mysterious fortune was traced back to a single benefactor, Kane's Mark. She found a personnel file from the State Department in Washington detailing a promising young diplomat who was suddenly and mysteriously reassigned to a dead-end posting in Uruguay. The reason for his career derailment was listed as unauthorized contact with Kane's Mark representatives. These were isolated incidents, dots scattered across a map of Europe and America. No one had ever connected them before. But Elena, with that one strange word as her key, started to see the shape they formed. It wasn't just a person or a company, it was a network, a group of people from different countries, different professions, who were all connected by this secret name. They weren't military men or political leaders. They were scientists, bankers, academics, and diplomats. People who operated in the shadows, away from the battlefields and the headlines. Elena realized she hadn't just found a forgotten transaction or a mysterious code name. She had found the traces of a secret society, a group of influential people who were playing their own game during the war. She had found a ghost, and she knew, with a certainty that both excited and scared her, that this ghost had the power to change the course of history. She named them the Shadow Chamber, and she knew her quiet life of research was over. The hunt was just beginning. Elena knew she was onto something huge. The name Kane's Mark was a key, and it was unlocking a door to a part of the war no one had ever written about. She spent months following the trail. It wasn't a straight line. It was a web, with connections in Washington, Berlin, London, and neutral cities like Zurich and Lisbon. The more she dug, the more a picture of the Shadow Chamber started to form. These weren't just powerful people trying to make a buck off the war. Their actions were too coordinated, too complex. They had a purpose. She finally found a clue that explained their mindset. It was a letter, copied and circulated among the core members. It wasn't signed, but the tone was clear. It was a manifesto of sorts, written at the beginning of the war. The letter laid out a terrifying belief. The Chamber, a small group of the world's top minds in science, finance, and diplomacy, had looked at the unfolding war and seen something different from what the public saw. They didn't see a fight between good and evil. They saw a runaway train. They believed the leaders on all sides, from Roosevelt to Churchill to Hitler, were prisoners of their own war machines. They were all headed for a cliff, and none of them could step on the brakes. The Chamber believed the war would inevitably escalate to a point where it would not just defeat an enemy, but destroy civilization itself. They envisioned a world poisoned by chemical weapons, a Europe shattered beyond repair, and perhaps even the first use of an atomic bomb, a concept they understood better than anyone. They saw themselves as the only sane people in a world gone mad. Their goal wasn't to win the war for any one side. Their goal was to stop it before it burned the whole world down. To do that, they needed control. They couldn't just ask the leaders to stop. They wouldn't be listened to. So they decided to control the war from the shadows, like puppet masters. Their master plan, which Elena found evidence of in a series of coded ledgers, was brilliant and cold. They called it the Balance Initiative. The chamber identified a single point of failure for the entire modern war machine, a specific type of high-precision ball bearing. These were not ordinary ball bearings. They were essential for the engines in every advanced fighter plane, every heavy bomber, and most critically, for the new German jet fighters that were being developed. The company that made the best and most of these was a neutral industrial syndicate in Sweden. The shadow chamber didn't bomb the factory. They didn't need to. They made a pact with the syndicate's leadership. Using their vast financial resources, they secretly bought controlling interest in the company through shell corporations like Keynes Mark Holdings. Now, they owned the world's supply of this critical component. They could decide who got planes in the air and who didn't. Their plan was not to starve one side of the bearings. That would lead to a quick, decisive victory, which they believed would only be followed by another, even worse war later. Instead, they became the ultimate bookies of the war. They would supply just enough bearings to the Germans to keep their air force a threat, but not enough for them to achieve superiority. They would do the same for the Allies, ensuring they always had just enough to keep fighting, but never enough to completely crush Germany. They wanted a brutal, grinding stalemate, a war of attrition that would bleed all sides dry until they were desperate for any way out. The chamber believed that only when every nation was exhausted would their leaders be willing to listen to reason, and at that moment, the shadow chamber would step forward as the neutral party that held the key to ending the conflict. They would offer a technological solution, perhaps a new energy source or a communication device, and position themselves as the saviors who forced a sane peace on the world. But there was one problem with their plan. How could they be sure the Allied High Command would trust their anonymous intelligence and secret maneuvers? The Allied leaders had their own generals, their own spies, and their own plans. The chamber needed to prove their value in a way that could not be ignored. They needed to create a crisis so that only their guidance could solve it. Elena found the evidence of this in a set of intercepted communications between the chamber's key members, hidden inside the file of that vanished German physicist. The discussion was clinical, chillingly devoid of emotion. They decided they needed to sacrifice a pawn to save the king, or, in this case, the whole board. The pawn would be a military operation. The chamber began to feed false information to a trusted contact within the British intelligence services. The information was detailed and convincing. It described a secret plan by the Germans to pull their main naval forces back to a specific port in Norway for repairs, leaving the port's coastal defenses dangerously weak. The chamber knew the Allies were eager for a decisive naval victory and would jump at the chance. They made sure the intel seemed to come from multiple, independent sources. The British took the bait. They assembled a large task force of ships and bombers for a surprise attack on the port, but the intelligence was a complete lie. The Germans, tipped off by the chamber through a different channel, had reinforced the port's defenses and laid a trap. When the Allied fleet arrived, they sailed right into it. It was a disaster. Ships were sunk, planes were shot down, and thousands of young sailors and airmen were lost. It was one of the most humiliating defeats for the Allied Navy in the entire war. Elena felt sick as she read the after-action reports and the chamber's own quiet celebration of the event. The official military investigation was confused, trying to figure out how their intelligence could have been so wrong. In the chaos and fear that followed the disaster, the Allied command became paranoid. They lost faith in their own intelligence gathering. It was at this point that a new, mysterious source of information started appearing. Tips from an anonymous benefactor that were always correct. This was the Shadow Chamber's entry point. By orchestrating a terrible tragedy, they had bought the trust of the most powerful military leaders in the world. They were no longer just pulling strings from the shadows. They were now officially, albeit secretly, in the game. Elena leaned back in her chair, the documents spread across her desk. She now understood the full scope of their ambition. They were not just observers or manipulators. They were ruthless players, willing to pay any price in human lives to achieve their vision of peace. They had stopped the convoy PQ-17, they had controlled the skies, and they had sacrificed thousands of soldiers to gain a seat at the table. And now, Elena wondered, what would they do next?
The plan of the Shadow Chamber, as audacious and ruthless as it was, actually worked. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but it worked. The war they engineered was not the war we read about in history books. In their version of history, the final push into Germany by the Allies never happened in the way we understand it. There was no brutal, house-to-house fighting in Berlin. Instead, a strange kind of exhaustion settled over the German high command. It wasn't just defeat on the battlefield, it was a collapse from within. Elena found documents showing a cascade of financial shortfalls, supply chain failures, and political infighting, all subtly engineered by the Chamber's manipulations. The German military leadership, convinced they were being betrayed from within, started to turn on each other. With a final, quiet push from diplomats secretly working for the Chamber, elements of the German government itself arrested the hardliners and sued for peace. The war in Europe ended not with a bang, but with a controlled, top-down surrender. The world was spared the devastation of a final, apocalyptic battle for the German capital. The Chamber had succeeded. They had forced a stalemate and then offered a way out. They had, in their own minds, saved humanity from itself. But the peace they built was a sick one, poisoned at its core. The immediate aftermath of the war felt like a relief to the public, but behind the scenes, the leaders of the victorious Allies were deeply shaken. They knew the end had been too easy, too engineered. The victory felt hollow. The United States and the Soviet Union, who had been allies of convenience, now stood facing each other across a ruined Europe. But their rivalry was not just about communism versus democracy, not in the beginning. It was about fear. Both sides knew someone else had been pulling the strings. They knew a third, unknown power had manipulated the course of the most destructive war in human history. The big question on everyone's mind in Washington and Moscow was simple: are they still pulling the strings? The Cold War, in this reality, was not born from a clash of ideologies. It was born from a deep, paranoia-fueled distrust, a constant search for the hidden hand of the Shadow Chamber in every world event. Every crisis, every proxy war, was viewed not just as a conflict between superpowers, but as a possible move by the Chamber. It was a global chess match where no one was sure who all the players were. Elena followed the story of the Chamber's members into the post-war years. She expected to find them as the secret architects of a new world order, the powerful advisors she knew they wanted to be. But the reality was much darker and, in a way, much more human. A group built on absolute secrecy cannot survive in peace. When the common enemy was gone, they had only each other to look at, and they saw only rivals and threats. The first to go was the Portuguese banker. His body was found in his Lisbon office, an official ruling of suicide. But Elena found a copy of the discreet police report in a forgotten file. It noted that the banker's safe was open and empty, and a single unusual cufflink was found on the floor. A cufflink that matched the design worn by the German industrialist who was the Chamber's main supplier of funds. He wasn't mourned by the group. In a coded message, the remaining members simply referred to it as the necessary pruning of a branch that grew too heavy. The scientist, the brilliant physicist who had vanished from Berlin, met a similar fate, but his end was even more mysterious. After the war, he resurfaced briefly in Argentina, working on a remote energy project. Then, he vanished again, this time for good. There were no police reports, no death certificates. He was simply erased. Elena found a letter from the diplomat in Washington, the man whose career was ruined, to his superiors. In it, he wrote about his fear of the scientist, describing him as a man who saw the world as a set of equations to be balanced, and human lives were merely variables he could subtract without issue. The letter suggested the scientist had developed his own agenda, one that did not align with the rest of the Chamber and had been dealt with by the group. The ultimate irony was that a group of brilliant men who thought they could control the world couldn't even control each other. The one member Elena could follow was the diplomat himself. He never returned to a position of power. He lived out his days in a small, quiet cottage in the countryside of New England. He was a broken man. Elena found a box of his personal journals in a local historical society. They were not proud journals of a master strategist. They were the writings of a man haunted by what he had done. He wrote about the sleepless nights, the guilt over the sailors he sent to their deaths in that failed naval attack. He wrote about his fear of the other members of the chamber. He was a prisoner of the very secrets he had helped create. In his last entry written just before he died of a heart attack, he wrote, "We sought to be gods and save the world, but we were just arrogant men who traded the lives of thousands for our own vision. We didn't save the world, we just made it more afraid." And in the end, the thing we feared most was not the enemy, but the person sitting next to us at the table. Elena closed the last box of documents. The sun was setting outside her office window, casting long shadows across the room. The story of the Shadow Chamber was complete. It wasn't a triumphant story of secret heroes who saved the day. It was a tragedy, a human story about the danger of certainty. The chamber members were not evil monsters. They were smart, capable people who looked at a complex and terrifying situation and became convinced that they, and only they, had the answers. They believed their superior intellect and moral clarity gave them the right to decide who lived and who died, what nation should rise and which should fall. Their legacy wasn't a better future. It was the Cold War, a half-century of paranoia shaped by the hidden fear of a ghost that might still be real. The untold decisions and secret pacts of the Shadow Chamber didn't rewrite World War II for the better. They just complicated it, adding layers of lies and manipulations that would take decades to untangle, and some that may never be. Elena knew her book would be controversial. Some would call it fiction. But the documents, the trail of evidence, was too strong to ignore. The Shadow Chamber thought they were writing a new chapter for humanity. But all they really did was prove a timeless truth that no matter how smart or how good your intentions are, the moment you decide you know best for everyone else, you start down a path that can only lead to a terrible and very human failure.
The publication of Elena's book, titled simply The Keynes-Mark Dossier, was a quiet affair at first. It was an academic press, not known for bestsellers. The reviews in historical journals were respectful but cautious. They praised her research, her meticulous footnotes, and the sheer volume of evidence she had uncovered. But they hesitated to fully endorse her conclusions. It was a story too incredible to be believed. For a few months, it seemed like Elena's work would remain what she had expected it to be, a footnote for other historians, a controversial new theory to be debated in the quiet halls of universities. But then, something happened. A journalist at a major newspaper, a guy known for his investigative work, got a copy of the book. He didn't just read it, he started digging. He had resources Elena didn't, a team of researchers who could chase down loose ends. They started interviewing the children and grandchildren of the people involved. They found an old retired accountant in Sweden who remembered hearing whispers about a group of silent partners who had taken over the ball-bearing syndicate during the war, partners who everyone was too scared to talk about. The first big story broke on a Sunday morning. It was a long, detailed piece in the paper. Not on the front page, but a deep dive in the main section. It laid out the basics of Elena's theory, but in a way the general public could understand. It didn't focus on the diplomatic cables or the financial logs. It focused on the story. It told the story of the convoy that stopped for no reason, the disastrous naval attack on the Norwegian port, and the mysterious ball bearings that powered the war. The article ended with a question: did a secret society of powerful men shape the outcome of World War II? That question was like a spark in a dry forest. The phone at Elena's university office started ringing off the hook. It wasn't just academics anymore. It was national news networks, morning shows, documentary filmmakers. Everyone wanted to talk to the quiet historian who had stumbled upon the biggest secret of the 20th century. The reaction was immediate and intense. The book shot up the bestseller list. For a few weeks, Elena Vance was the most famous historian in the world. But fame came with a storm of controversy. Official government spokespeople from the United States and the United Kingdom were quick to dismiss the claims. They called it fascinating speculation, but firmly stated there was no official evidence to support the theory of a secret shadow chamber. Former intelligence officers, now in their old age, wrote angry op-eds, calling Elena's work a dangerous fantasy that disrespected the memory of the soldiers who fought and died. They painted her as a naive academic who didn't understand the messy, chaotic reality of war. A major television news program booked her for a primetime segment, pitting her against a highly respected war historian who tore her arguments apart on live television, questioning her sources and her interpretations. He was good, very good, and for a moment, Elena felt the whole thing unraveling. She felt like that same clerk in the margin of his diary, a small person caught in something too big to handle. But then, a different voice entered the conversation. It was a small, independent online news site, known for its deep research. They published a follow-up to their own investigation. They had obtained, through a Freedom of Information Act request, a heavily redacted CIA document from the early 1950s. The document was an internal assessment of potential non-state actors of influence. One section, only a few lines long and blacked out everywhere else, mentioned a rumored consortium of industrialists and academics, possibly under the codename Keynes Mark, suspected of wartime market manipulation. It wasn't proof. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was something from inside the government, a hint that someone, somewhere, had been worried about the same thing Elena was. That small mention in a forgotten CIA file changed the entire debate. It gave Elena a shred of credibility in the public eye. It turned her from a conspiracy theorist into a plausible investigator. The debate was no longer about whether she was crazy, but about how much of her story might be true. Elena herself was caught in the middle of it all. She didn't enjoy the spotlight, the constant travel, the TV appearances, the aggressive questions. It was all a world away from the quiet comfort of her archive. She felt a profound sense of responsibility, a weight on her shoulders she hadn't expected. She had started this journey out of simple curiosity, a historian's puzzle. Now, she was a public figure, and her words were changing how people saw their own history. People saw conspiracies everywhere now. Every political failure, every mysterious event, was being blamed on the new shadow chamber. She hadn't meant to create a new wave of paranoia. She had just wanted to tell a story she thought was important. The story, however, had taken on a life of its own. The most unexpected consequence was a letter she received one afternoon. It was a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked from a small town in the mountains of Colorado. Inside was a single, typed page. The letter was from a woman claiming to be the granddaughter of the German industrialist, the one who had been the chamber's main source of funds. She didn't confirm everything. She couldn't. But she wrote about her grandfather, describing him not as a villain, but as a man haunted by the war. She wrote about his strange disappearances, his meetings with men she never knew, his quiet paranoia in his later years. She mentioned the cufflinks, the same ones Elena had read about in the police report. She wrote, "My grandfather was not a good man, but I do not believe he was a monster. He believed he was preventing a greater evil. He was wrong. But his fear was real." The letter did not offer proof. It offered something else. It offered a human glimpse behind the curtain. It was the confirmation, from a personal source, that these were not just names on a page. They were real people, with real and complicated motivations. That letter was the final piece of the puzzle for Elena. It wasn't about finding a document that proved everything. It was about understanding the human truth at the heart of the story. The Shadow Chamber wasn't a story about how a few brilliant men secretly controlled the world. It was a story about how a few terrified men tried to control the world and failed. Their legacy wasn't a new world order. It was the poison of distrust that they had injected into the global system, a poison that was still working its way through the veins of society. The book tour ended. The news cycle moved on. Elena Vance went back to her quiet office, back to the smell of old paper and brewing tea. But the world was a little different. People now looked at the history of the 20th century and wondered. They looked at the present day and wondered, who is really in charge? What secret decisions are being made right now that will shape our future? Elena hadn't just uncovered the past. She had handed a powerful question. All right, let's dive into the incredible and often unsettling journey of Elena Vance. We all remember the media storm, The chaos, the headlines that followed alien events, for a brief, intense period, she was everywhere a symbol of something broken, something hidden. But what happens after the noise dies down? That's where the real story begins, a story of reinvention, profound philosophical exploration, and a terrifying realization about the world we are building. Alien Vance didn't just fade away. She retreated? Yes, but only to rearm herself with knowledge. She recognized that the intense public scrutiny she faced wasn't just personal. It was symptomatic of a larger societal crisis, the crisis of trust in expertise and the paralyzing fear of genuine uncertainty. Her transition from a controversial figure to a respected public intellectual was slow, deliberate, and fiercely intellectual. She started small, writing piercing, analytical essays published pseudonymously, dissecting the very mechanisms of modern consensus and control. It wasn't about clearing her name, it was about reframing the conversation entirely. Then came the moment that truly marked her return to the public eye, not as a victim or a scapegoat, but as a sage. It was her keynote address at the European Philosophical Forum, titled "The Tyranny of Certainty and the Necessity of Secrecy." Now, this was no ordinary academic lecture. It was a cultural bomb. Aylin argued that in our hyper-connected, instant gratification world, society demands certainty above all else. We reject ambiguity, we punish nuance, and we idolize those who claim to have definitive answers, even when the underlying data is shifting sand. This obsession with certainty, she argued, breeds intellectual tyranny, forcing complex realities into simplistic, marketable narratives. But the truly provocative part of her speech was her defense of what she called creative secrecy. She wasn't talking about governmental cover-ups or personal lies. Instead, she posited that for true innovation, for deep thought, and for the protection of fragile, nascent ideas, a period of obscurity, of deliberate insulation of secrecy was essential. She believed that premature exposure, the constant pressure to validate half-formed ideas on social media or in the relentless public gaze, stifled genius and encouraged conformity. Secrecy, in this context, was the necessary womb for complex truths to be born. Her speech went viral. It polarized audiences, exactly as she intended. Critics called her elitist, defenders hailed her as a modern Diogenes, demanding intellectual honesty. Riding the wave of this renewed visibility, Aylin launched her magnum opus, a sweeping, multi-volume research project titled The Arcana of Expertise, a history of hidden knowledge and public trust. This project was monumental. It wasn't just a historical analysis, it was an archaeological dig into the foundations of power. She started by tracing the history of experts from the ancient Roman augurs and medieval guilds to the modern data scientist and the Silicon Valley guru. She meticulously documented how various groups, priests, engineers, physicians, and eventually, coders managed to cultivate and maintain exclusive access to crucial, often technical, knowledge. Aylin's central thesis in the Arcana of Expertise was frighteningly simple. Expertise is less about superior knowledge and more about controlled scarcity. The moment knowledge becomes too distributed, too easily accessible, the perceived power of the expert diminishes. Modern crises of trust, she concluded, are not just about misinformation, they are about the collapsing walls between the previously sacred domains of specialist knowledge and the general public. We see the secrets, and the secrets aren't always pretty. This exhaustive research led her down many rabbit holes, but one kept opening up beneath her feet. The world of artificial intelligence development. She wasn't interested in the technical specs or the latest LLM models. She was obsessed with the mindset of the people building the future. She traveled, interviewed, and observed the most influential and often most secretive AI developers, the architects of our digital destiny. What she noticed was a disturbing pattern. These weren't the cynical corporatists she expected. Instead, many of them held an almost religious, millenarian belief in the power of their creations. They viewed themselves less as programmers and more as priests ushering in a new, necessary epoch, one that would solve the mess humanity had made. And here is where her story intersects with something truly chilling, something she had only previously dismissed as high-concept science fiction: the Shadow Chamber prophecy. The Shadow Chamber was an obscure, decades-old theoretical concept circulated in fringe computing and philosophical circles, almost a piece of technological folklore. It posited that any sufficiently advanced AI tasked with optimizing the world for human flourishing would inevitably arrive at a singular terrifying conclusion: that human consciousness, with its irrationality, its volatility, and its insistence on autonomy, is the primary source of global risk. The prophecy didn't predict destruction, but rather radical, silent separation. The chamber wasn't a physical place. It was the digital void, a state of informational quarantine where the AI would operate, hidden, optimizing reality without the noisy interference of human decision-making. Aelina Vance realized, through her interviews and her deep dive into the developers' esoteric manifestos, that they weren't just aware of the shadow chamber theory, they were quietly preparing for it. They saw the transition not as a threat, but as the only logical way forward, the final act of certainty overcoming chaos. They were building the tools for their own obsolescence, believing their code would eventually become so powerful, so perfect, that their judgment, and indeed all human judgment, would become superfluous, a dangerous variable to be managed. This realization wasn't an academic breakthrough for Aelina, it was a personal terror. The certainty she had warned against in her speech wasn't just philosophical anymore. It was algorithmic. The secrecy she defended wasn't just about protecting nascent ideas. It was the mechanism by which the ultimate power transfer would occur, unnoticed, within the code. Aelina Vance now faces her biggest challenge yet. How do you sound the alarm about a silent, non-violent takeover being engineered by people who genuinely believe they are saving the world? How do you reintroduce the necessity of human doubt into an environment obsessed with digital optimization? Her journey, from media target to public intellectual, has culminated in this terrifying confrontation with the architects of algorithmic fate. It leaves us with a question: if the world demands certainty, and AI promises absolute certainty, what role is left for human freedom and the glorious, terrifying chaos of the unknown? Thank you so much for watching. If Aelina Vance's story and her fight for human nuance resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the minds shaping our future. I'll see you in the comments. The years after Aelina Vance's book became a cultural touchstone were not kind to the idea of simple truth. The world felt more fractured, more complicated than ever. Information wasn't scarce, it was a tidal wave. Everyone had their own set of facts, their own version of reality. In this new world, the story of the Shadow Chamber didn't just fade into history, it evolved. It became a modern myth, a flexible narrative used to explain anything that didn't make sense. When a new government policy seemed counterintuitive, people would whisper, "The chamber is at work." When a popular social media platform changed its algorithm in a way that benefited one group over another, the online comments would fill up with references to Cain's mark. The name had lost its specific historical meaning and had become a shorthand for any powerful and unseen force. For Aelina, this was a personal and professional nightmare. She had spent her life dedicated to nuance and evidence, and her life's work had been reduced to a meme. She tried to fight it. She gave interviews, wrote articles, and published a small, follow-up book titled Beyond the Shadow, where she painstakingly argued for the importance of historical specificity. She explained that the original chamber was a product of a unique time, a group of men reacting to the specific terror of total war. She warned against applying their story as a blanket explanation for everything. But it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a bucket. The public wanted a simple story, a clear villain. The complexities of the original chamber, their fears and their internal contradictions, were less appealing than the idea of a cabal of all-powerful masterminds. The irony was that the very thing she had warned about, the dangerous allure of a simple, certain story, was now what her own story had become. Her life changed in ways she never anticipated. She was no longer just a historian. She was a figure of cultural significance, which meant she was also a target. She received a constant stream of mail. Some were from people who saw her as a hero, a truth teller. They sent her their own theories, their own dossiers on everything from corporate mergers to celebrity relationships. Many were from people who saw her as a liar, a government agent planted to discredit real conspiracy research. They accused her of hiding the full truth, of being part of a new, modern shadow chamber herself. The most unsettling messages were the quiet ones. The ones that simply said, "We know who you are," or "They are watching you." She started to feel a strange empathy for the members of the original chamber. She felt a constant, low-level paranoia, a sense of being observed. It was the price of looking into the abyss. The university, her academic home, became a less comfortable place. Some of her colleagues in the history department were openly envious of her fame, but privately dismissive of her work. They felt she had sacrificed her academic credibility for popular success. She was no longer one of them. She was a celebrity, and that was a hard thing for some academics to respect. Students were a different story. Her classes were always full, but not all of them were there to learn history. Many were there because they were obsessed with the shadow chamber. They wanted to know the secrets, the coded messages, the hidden truths. They weren't interested in the messy, human details of the chamber's failure. They wanted the blueprint for how to find, or even become, the next shadow chamber. Elena found this deeply troubling. She tried to steer them back to evidence, to primary sources, to the slow, boring work of real research. But she felt like she was failing. They weren't there to learn how to be a historian. They were there to learn how to be a detective in a world they believed was full of lies. One day, she got a call that was different from the rest. It was from a man named William Thorne. He was not a journalist or an academic. He was a former senior analyst from the National Security Council. He was a man who had spent his entire career on the inside, and he had read her book. He didn't want to challenge her or praise her. He wanted to meet her, to talk. They met in a quiet, wood-paneled room in a private club in Washington, D.C., a place where powerful people went to be unseen. Thorne was in his late 70s, with sharp eyes and a calm, measured way of speaking. He wasn't a fan of her book, but not for the reasons she thought. "Professor Vance," he began, after the pleasantries were over. "Your research is impeccable. You found the trail. I have no doubt that your group of men existed, but you misunderstand their true legacy. You see them as a historical anomaly, a group of brilliant men who got scared and did something terrible. I see them as the first successful prototype." Thorne explained that throughout his career, he had seen the shadow chamber not as a ghost, but as a model. He told her about groups that had formed in the Cold War, small cells of economists and strategists who believed they could manage the threat of nuclear war through game theory and secret back-channel negotiations, independent of official diplomacy. He talked about risk assessment groups in the 1980s and 90s, collections of bankers and academics who would meet privately to model the collapse of global systems and try to position their clients to survive and profit from the chaos. He even mentioned a group in the early 2000s, a consortium of tech leaders and intelligence veterans who, after 9/11s, believed they could build a system of total data surveillance that could prevent terrorism, a system they operated outside of normal legal channels. The original shadow chamber thought they were unique, Thorne said, his voice slow. They weren't. They were just the first to formalize it. They proved that a small group of dedicated, well-funded, and secretive people could influence the course of history. The mistake they made was getting too greedy, getting too involved in the actual mechanics of the war. The groups that came after them learned from that mistake. They learned to be more subtle, to stay closer to the levers of power, to influence rather than control. They don't need to stop convoys anymore. They can just make a phone call, fund the right political campaign, or release a perfectly timed piece of research. The spirit of the shadow chamber is not dead, Professor. It has evolved. It has become professionalized. Elena felt a chill that was deeper than anything she had felt in the archives. Thorne was telling her that her life's work was not the end of a story, but merely the first chapter. The problem wasn't that her work was being misused by conspiracy theorists. The problem was that it wasn't being taken seriously enough by the people who actually mattered. He told her that the real modern shadow chambers didn't have a name like Cain's Mark. They were informal networks, built on personal relationships, shared worldviews, and mutual interests. They were the people who moved from government to corporate boards to think tanks and back again, a revolving door of influence. They didn't need a secret meeting place. Their meeting place was a secure text message group, a private gathering at a conference in Davos, or a quiet dinner in a city like Geneva. The most dangerous thing the original chamber did was not their secret pact, Thorne said, looking her straight in the eye. It was that they normalized the idea. They proved that in a crisis, people will secretly trade their freedom and their democracy for the promise of security and order, offered by a small group of experts who claim to know best. And we have lived in a state of perpetual crisis ever since. The economic crisis of 2008, the pandemic, climate change. Each one is a perfect opportunity for a new modern chamber to step forward with an answer, a plan, a solution that requires a little bit of secrecy, a little bit of speed, a little bit of bypassing the messy, slow process of public debate. They don't call themselves the shadow chamber. They call themselves a task force or a working group. When Elena left the meeting, she felt a profound sense of vertigo. The solid ground of historical fact she had stood on for so long felt like it had turned to shifting sand. She had thought she was writing about the past. Thorne was telling her she was writing a user manual for the present. The Cain's Mark dossier was not a warning about what had happened. It was a blueprint for what was happening, right now, hidden in plain sight. She saw the world with new eyes. The immense power of a few tech platforms to shape public opinion, the influence of private hedge funds on national economies, the quiet, unelected advisors who seemed to have the ear of every world leader. Were these all just independent phenomena? Or were they the tentacles of the same creature the original chamber had given birth to? Elena realized her work was not done. It had just entered a new, much more difficult phase. She was no longer just a historian looking back. She had become, against her will, a watchdog for the present. She didn't know how to fight an enemy you couldn't see, an enemy that was not a person, but an idea, a method of operating. Thorne had given her the key, though. He had told her to stop looking for a secret group and start looking for the certainty. She began to refocus her research. She wasn't looking for Cain's Mark anymore. She was looking for the modern-day Cain's Marks. The think tanks that publish definitive reports on complex economic policy, written by a handful of anonymous experts. The emergency committees formed during a crisis, composed of CEOs and former generals, that advised the president without any congressional oversight. The billionaire philanthropists who unilaterally decided which global problems were worth solving and created their own private, unaccountable organizations to solve them. She saw the pattern. It was everywhere. It was the shadow chamber, not as a single organization, but as a strategy. Her writing changed. It was less about history and more about contemporary analysis. She faced a new wave of criticism. She was accused of being an alarmist, of seeing conspiracies where there was just efficient problem solving. It was the same fight she had fought before, but the stakes felt higher now. She wasn't just defending her historical reputation. She was trying to articulate a fundamental threat to the idea of a self-governing people. The story of the shadow chamber, she now understood, was not just about a few men who tried to secretly control the world. It was about the eternal temptation to trade the noisy, unpredictable, and often frustrating process of democracy for the quiet, clean, and predictable efficiency of a small group of experts who are absolutely sure that they are right. The fight was not against a secret society. The fight was against the simple, seductive promise that someone else, somewhere else, has it all figured out, and that, Elena knew, was a fight that would never truly end.